this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. As some of you may know, I'm also a First World War historian, and the academic history of the war can be very different from the public perspective, which dwells on the first 2 years of the war. Forgetting the victories of 1917 and 1918 is not new. It is something that the British Army did during the interwar period. Added to this corporate amnesia, there was very little discussion in Britain on who the army might be expected to fight. All this culminated in 1939 with the British Army unprepared for war and the defeat in France in 1940. Joining me once more is Rob Lyman, who, with Richard Dannatt, has written a compelling account of the mismanagement of the British Army from the end of the First World War to the start of the next. Robert, welcome back. I thoroughly enjoyed Victory to Defeat. It may well be my book of the year. Let's start with 1918. When people think of the First World War, especially in Britain, they tend to think of those first 2 years, which include the Battle of the Somme. But as you point out in the book, the key year is 1918, and we have chosen to forget that.
When Richard and I sat down and we sort of set out the whatever everyone now calls the narrative arc, but we always call it story. What is it that we're trying to say? We knew that there was we had to describe the dramatic success of the British Army, particularly at the end of 1918, because that's something culturally we've forgotten. But what I wasn't so au fait with until I spoke to people like Gary Sheffield and Jonathan Boff and Spencer and so on was the how much the battleground is around the historiography and the study of the First World War, around the learning curve and around the role of the generals and enabling that to occur. And I think when we finished our first 4 chapters, we sat down and we sent them to some peer reviewers to see what they thought. And all of them, to be fair, agreed with us, except for one. He sent about 20 pages of notes back saying, I just disagree with all of this. And we eventually got on a Zoom call and we talked to him and I laid out our argument. And the base of our argument was that within 2 years, so from 1916, 1st July 1916 to the end of 1918, the British Army demonstrated quite dramatic changes in the way it undertook offensive operations. And the evidence could be seen in a whole array of areas, not least of all the integration of we actually started with the construction of an infantry platoon. So the construction of an infantry platoon in the Fourth Army in 1918 was basically divided between, there was a section of riflemen, but a section of grenadiers and a section of machine gunners with Lewis machine guns. And most of the soldiers, we came across accounts of soldiers throwing away their rifles in the attack because they were so heavily burdened down with the 47-round magazines of Lewis, for the Lewis guns, they didn't want to carry their rifle because they never used the rifles. And same with the guys who were carrying Hessian sacks full of hand grenades because the rifle was a waste of time. That was really, really powerful to us. But this guy, when I challenged him, I said, well, what's the basis of your opposition to this idea? And he said, well, my father, he was an elderly academic, he said, well, my father said the generals were rubbish. And that was the basis of it. So we were quite happy to dismiss his suggested corrections. It's a very interesting reality that we culturally remember 1916, and not just in the UK, but of course the Commonwealth, as reflective of World War I's the experience of World War I or the First World War, and we have forgotten the great successes and the victories of 1918, and the balance between the two. We are so fixated on 1916 rather than 1918, and I think that's unfair because, as we say in the book, it was the same generals who achieved victory in 1918 who were instrumental in some of the cock-ups in 1916. And we need to understand why that massive slaughter took place. That particular individual I mentioned said, well, of course, you've got by 1918, a higher degree of industrialized slaughter. I said, well, you're using a phrase that is quite emotive and actually doesn't always accord with the facts. So I took him through the work that Nick Lloyd had undertaken in his book on 1918 and looked at the numbers of casualties And of course, you've got relatively the same number, so the quantum of casualties in the British Army between 1918 and 1916. But what you've got in 1918 is a very large number increase in soldiers participating. So the pro rata casualty rate has gone down dramatically, really, really dramatically, as a result of the new tactics and the new approaches. And we were very, very struck by a number of analyses of 1916, not just Gary Sheffield, but Jonathan Boff and Nick Lloyd as well, which looked at the reality that the difference between the attacks on the 1st of July, where you've got basically three armies coming together. You've got the old contemptibles, you've got the new conscripts coming through, and you've got Kitchener's armies all coming in with the urgent necessity to attack the Germans without any real training. Most soldiers spent the weeks and months leading up to the 1st of July 1916.
This is the learning curve on the Somme, isn't it? Which isn't a one-day thing. There's months of the Somme that we forget about.
Oh, there's months of Somme. That's right. My point is most of the troops preparing for the 1st of July in the Somme were doing labouring tasks. They were rolling out wire and, they were building things. They weren't actually training to attack in an efficient way. But within 2 weeks of that terrible first day on the Somme, they were attacking in many places in a very intelligent way. And that process of learning, I keep on explaining to people that learning isn't parabolic. It's not a nice and even shape. It's a bit bumpy, but I think it was bumpy and it was increasing in effectiveness through 1917. And Plummer was instrumental in a lot of learning as well. And then by 1918, it really skyrocketed. Helped, I think, by the failure of the German Michael offensive in March 1918, which demonstrated to the British that actually one of the key factors in achieving success was sustainment. If you simply attacked without being able to keep the attack going with artillery with you, particularly food and fuel and ammunition being carried up behind the leading troops, then you would quickly run out of steam.
But that spring offensive is wildly successful, isn't it? They smash through the British lines, and so what have they learned on their learning curve? Because everybody's learning.
Well, it was wildly successful if you count the yardage of ground successfully secured, but it was a disaster, actually, because it was unable to be sustained. So it was a one-shot weapon. And the reality is the British line bowed very significantly all the way back to Amiens, but it didn't break. And the British were able to contain the offensive and allow it to run out of steam. And whilst there was a quite dramatic bow in the line, the Germans were then dramatically extended. They realized that they were overextended. In the months following, they started withdrawing back to the Hindenburg line and reducing the number of troops that they had in forward areas because of this huge salient they had created. They had run out of effort. They'd run out of troops. And the counteroffensive, when it took place from August onwards, was fantastically effective. And the British I call the British, but the British and Commonwealth armies achieved a very dramatic success in the 100 days.
Would I be fair in saying this is the British Army winning the First World War, but we now choose to forget it?
You are absolutely right. That is our conclusion. The British Army militarily defeated Ludendorff's armies in the field, and we now choose to forget it. Now, it's very, very interesting that when the war was ended, the British Army between November 1918 and November 1919 dramatically reduced in size, and all of that corporate knowledge and experience of victory disappeared. Virtually all of it disappeared. And but it's interesting, in 1919 and 1920, when celebrations took place in November of each year thereafter to remember the end of the war and the victory that had been achieved, soldiers turned up to celebrate the victory. And they were surprised as the years went by that people turned up not to celebrate the victory, but to remember the sacrifice. And within 5 years or so, the Remembrance Day ceremonies on the 11th of November had become remembrances of sacrifice and remembrances of those who had lost their lives, not celebrations of victory. And this was a very, very important nuance.
Interesting nuance on that was pointed out to me last year, I think. You've got to remember the poppy is not about remembering the dead. It's actually about remembering those who survived the war. And that's completely lost now because it's to remember the dead.
Now, it's important that we remember the dead, but it's really important that we remember the dramatic success of 1918 and we remember the living, because if you forget the victory, then you are forced into a position, I say you, but generally you're forced into an intellectual position that regards the First World War as a futile waste of human endeavor. Now, wars are a dreadful waste of blood and treasure, but it's wrong, in our view, to suggest that the war was entirely, from 1916 to 1918, that the war was a futile industrial slaughter machine and was wasteful and only came to an end because of exhaustion. It's simply not true. We don't argue the rights and wrongs of the war in the book. That's not our place. What we do is we demonstrate that from 1916 in particular to 1918, the British Army transformed itself through this dramatic learning curve. The generals on the whole in 1918 were those who had been around in 1916. They learned a huge amount, and the British Army became dramatically professional, dramatically effective at training under General Max and so on. The Fourth Army, which is the army which we used to focus our effort in terms of understanding the war, led by General Rawlinson, which had a British Corps, a Canadian Corps, and an Australian Corps, really epitomized the dramatic changes that had occurred during the war. It really is important that we remember that was brought about by a huge investment in blood and treasure. And unfortunately, the reasons for success and all the mechanisms and structures and so on that allowed that success to take place was then forgotten in the 1920s, to the great loss of Britain and her army when it came to the next time that it was called upon to defend the country against an aggressor. Because if the country had remembered how to fight a high-intensity campaign against a first-class enemy, as indeed it had undertaken in 1918, even though it may not have had the resources to train and practice that, in the interwar years, it would have made a material difference to the ability of the army to deal with the Germans again in 1940. And it's very interesting that whilst Britain completely forgot the reasons for success in 1918, the Germans didn't. And we make that observation a number of times. The Reichswehr, which was established after Versailles, led for many years by General Seck, actually took the lessons of the 100 Days and worked on them to create their own offensive military doctrine that we saw, to our cost and our shame, used against us in 1940. And it's a very interesting thing when you consider all of this, that actually in 1914, we, the British Army, didn't fully understand what the Germans were doing to us. And we should have done. We should have remembered. And even if we had simply undertaken a review of our doctrine in 1919 and 20, we had learnt the lessons or written down the lessons of 1918, and applied them in our training and our staff training and so on, it would have made all the difference, because understanding what the Germans were doing in 1940 was something that was completely lacking. When Richard and I sat down to write the book at the start of lockdown, this was the thing that really challenged us most of all. It was the thing that was really worrying. An army needs to understand how to fight, yes, and needs to understand who it's going to fight and how. And in 1918, we got that sorted. But at no stage in the years that followed did we sit down and ever do a lessons learned. That only took place in 1931, and it wasn't a proper exercise. It didn't actually lead to a doctrinal restructuring of the army. And that was partly because so many soldiers, officers and thinkers had left the army by that stage. It was also due really to a quite pervasive idea, both in society and in the army, that the First World War was an aberration and that we'd never have to fight anything like this again, and that we could just revert to the comfortable days of small wars that had been our lot in the British Army before 1914, without recognizing that actually a war of the kind that the world had seen in 1914-18 couldn't be undone or unforgotten. And the reality is that when we came to 1940 and the world went back into a major conflagration, it was based on the industrial lessons and the the lessons of mass mobile armies that we had learned in 1918 but had chosen to forget. So, I mean, we're in the book, we are critical, I think, of two things. We're critical of an army forgetting what it needed to remember. And we are critical also of a government which was quite happy with that state of affairs because it wasn't being challenged by the army to rearm or rebuild itself with modern weaponry and with an approach to high-intensity training that it would need were it to fight the Germans again. There's a lot of wishful thinking going on in the 1920s, not just in government, but also in the army.
Did the army ever reflect at the end of the war? You know, the war's coming, and how to do a drawdown? If they're with you know, do we keep this? Do we keep that? It kind of seems an obvious thing to do, to think, you know, what. How are we going to rebuild if necessary? Who do we need to keep? Because I think the Germans kept more officers, didn't they? Thinking they might have to.
They did. So the Germans, no, very, very sadly, it's a very depressing story. There was no thinking about retaining a core of capability. So the idea of a capability-based army was new. No one had really thought this through. By capability-based army, I mean identifying the core aspects of your fighting power: armor, artillery, mechanized infantry, integrated aircraft, and so on, and thinking about retaining the core aspects of that capability and understanding how it operated and retaining that in your future army. That was never, ever considered. And the army was reduced dramatically. In fact, there was a fight to keep the Royal Tank Corps, which ultimately became the Royal Tank Regiment. There was, you know, most opinion actually in 1919, 1920 was just to get rid of the tanks. Who needed tanks again? That was an aberration. That was something spun out by the mud and the blood of Flanders, and they would never be required again, which is quite extraordinary when you think about what the Germans and the Russians actually did in the 1920s and 30s, which is to create the concept of mobile maneuver based around armor and integrating artillery and infantry and aircraft into that idea. So the reality is the army drew down very rapidly, and all that capability was lost. And the army that then sort of fell out, shook itself out in the 1920s and into the 1930s, was an infantry-based army focused on garrisoning the empire. So the fight then to reintroduce the tank into the structure of the army, to think about creating combined arms forces as the doctrinal underpinning of the way the new army would fight. You know, it was always going to fight a losing battle. And we trace the arguments that took place in the 1920s and 30s to develop tanks, to develop integration, and they were really undertaken on the periphery of the army's business. They didn't stand out as being central to the army's thinking about who it was and what it needed to be and how it needed to fight for the future. We're pretty even-handed in our criticism, half to the army for not really making sure it focused hard on how to fight. And the comparison here is with the Germans, who were working. They did nothing but focus on how they're going to fight the next war. And the other criticism was against the government for failing to see the army as anything more than a utilitarian instrument to defend the empire.
Well, it's interesting how the RAF come out, because by now they're an independent component. So rather than play to how to win the next war, they play to demonstrate how there could be a cheap colonial police force, which is quite a good card to play.
It was a very good card to play. I mean, there are lots of things running in parallel here. So as the 1920s went on, there was a growing public, hatred of the idea of another war. And out of that grew quite a strong pacifistic movement. But alongside that was an argument about the future use of aerial bombing and the use of the area of the bomber, and the idea developed that the bomber would always get through, and that all European cities lay prostrate at the threat of the bomber. And actually, none of that was true. Well, it was only partly true. 1920s saw a very strong argument in favor of the bomber. And it assumed degrees of accuracy of bombing. It assumed degrees of design and the mechanization and engineering for bombers that just didn't exist at that time. So, for instance, bombers that were being designed in the 1920s and 30s to fight a war against the likeliest foe couldn't even get to Germany. And yet, one of the strongest criticisms we do make, is that by 1935, when rearmament is suddenly switched on again, most of the money flows into both the Navy, but also primarily into the RAF to build aircraft that are frankly obsolete. So in 1935, before 1935, we were spending around 2% or just over 2% of our GDP on defense. 1935 and the years that followed, it jumped up to 8%. By 1939, it had jumped to 40%. So a dramatic rise in spending, but you've got to be careful about what you spend it on. And spending it on bombers that can't reach Germany and aircraft that are badly designed. And I have to say it was a complete fluke, frankly, that we were able to divert quite a bit of that money to building Hurricanes and Spitfires in 1937, 38, 39, largely because people who were making those spending decisions, and I exaggerate a little bit, but this is a primary argument, saw fighters as cheaper. You can get many more aircraft for a lot less money. Bombers were very, very expensive. But if they hadn't done that, we wouldn't have had the ability to staunch the Luftwaffe armadas that were over our skies in 1940. So a little bit of serendipity here. We weren't aware of this as we started. So this is a consequence of our thinking and our weekly debates about the book and as the chapters progressed. And this is the fact that the army has always, in British history, by British governments, been seen as a utilitarian instrument. We've sort of come up with this phrase, which means it's there for things, for it to be used for emergencies when things occur. Like, it acts really like a fire brigade. So the army, it doesn't really have much purpose. We can expand the army really quickly when we need to. But if there's a requirement for a fire brigade, we'll send the army out, and it's pretty adaptable, and so on. The Navy has always been regarded as Britain's deterrent and the single security instrument for the British Isles and its empire. In the 1920s, of course, that was added to by people who were pressing this argument that the RAF would deter Hitler and deter any attack on Britain, because if we had lots of bombers and someone attacked us, we could then counterattack them and destroy them so they wouldn't dream of attacking Britain. That failed. 20 years of RAF, of deterrence based on the idea of the RAF and bombers failed miserably, of course, the moment the first German aircraft and Italian aircraft arrived over British skies. And yet you couldn't argue against that philosophy in the 1920s and 30s, so strongly held it was. And there's a real lesson here, because the army was never regarded as a deterrent. When we got to 1936, we had a very interesting moment, because the interesting moment was, we know now that Hitler was terrified of a French or a British response to the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, which was a fundamental aspect of the Versailles Agreement, that the Rhineland would remain demilitarized. And of course, the moment he marched in, it really unraveled the entire European security structure. And the reason it unraveled wasn't because actually Hitler moved in, it's because France and Britain did nothing about it. And we then had a couple of very interesting hours where we debated this proposition. What would have happened had Britain had a mobile division, or a mobile capability, an expeditionary capability, and had sent its troops back into the Rhineland to force the Germans out? Well, the first thing is, we know the Germans would have left. Hitler accepted that immediately, and he said it afterwards. He had a very tenuous relationship with the Reichswehr at the time, or the Wehrmacht then, and the generals weren't supportive of him. They regarded him as a parvenu, and yet, by not acting against Germany in 1936, we, the West, Britain and France, forced the army and Hitler together. So not acting in 1936 was a desperately poor move by Britain, and we argue may well have prevented, if we'd acted, may well have prevented the Second World War happening at all. So there's a real lesson here. Having military credibility, so an army that could deploy effectively and in a coherent fashion in 1936 could have prevented the Second World War. Now, politicians, think about that. What are we missing now in our ability to deploy force as a country as part of our diplomatic and political efforts to ensure the security of Europe? What are we missing that will prevent us from doing the same again? And that's the challenge I think we get to in the book, which is not necessarily we need to rearm because we've got an army that's been hollowed out dramatically. That's true. But it's the inability of our political masters to have a useful tool when it's necessary. That's the big lesson we walked away with. I mean, the book wasn't designed to be a parallel lesson between today and the 1930s, because we do live in different times, and those parallels can be somewhat forced. But if there's one very, very important lesson, it's that you need the country for its own security needs the insurance policy of a highly credible, highly capable, deployable expeditionary army if it is to contribute to the country's defense and security needs. Now, our defense and security needs are framed in Europe, are framed around NATO. But we, as a country, can't support NATO militarily for any length of time. It's hard to think that we might be able to sustain anything more than an armoured brigade for more than 6 months. And that's not supporting NATO. That's not supporting Britain's long-term security needs in Europe. And it's particularly pertinent when we think that we don't have this capability when we've got a rampant Russia trying to force its will on Ukraine.
Is the part of the problem, well, then rather than now, is at least now we understand, the military has some idea of what it wants to create, a force. But then in these interwar years, what amazes me that Camberley and people like that are not even drawing things out, these ideas out to try and even give a structure to what we might need.
Yeah, it's a real challenge because the situation is that, and we make a big case of this in the book. We say that a country has to have a proper defense and security analysis. It needs to understand who it's likely to have to fight. And in the 1920s and 30s, the enemy was nebulous. It was the requirement was to defend the empire. Who was going to challenge the empire? Well, it was tribesmen in the northwest frontier. But you need to be really, really ruthless in your analysis of what the threats are likely to be, because during the time when we were saying, well, the greatest threat to this country was maybe the northwest frontier of India, we had incredible political chaos in Europe. We had the end of the Weimar Republic. We had, by 1933, the rise of totalitarianism, actually much earlier in Italy, but the rise of totalitarianism and the destruction of democracy in Europe. We had complete political chaos in Russia since 1917, and all in a way that was so completely different to the years before 1914. And we didn't sit down as a country and say, gosh, the consequences of this inflammation of political discord in Europe actually creating a fire and sweeping across Europe and involving us again is very significant. Therefore, we need to create an army, or at least think through what force structures we need. And at the same time, think through how we might have to fight a war, in which case the greatest template we've got is the offensive lessons of 1918. No one did that. So those two things were dramatically missing. Why was that the case? Well, the first thing is that in 1918, of course, as I've suggested, the army reduced in size dramatically, and it didn't have the intellectual backdraft, didn't have the intellectual legs, the intellectual memory of what had happened in 1918, and no one sat down and wrote the lessons. Secondly, there was no single place in the army to deposit doctrine. So there was no repository for doctrinal thinking. That's the point about how you actually fight. Indeed, there is no repository in the army for thinking about who we might fight. Now, you would argue that this actually sits in that nexus, the relationship between cabinet and the War Office, as it was at the time. And you're right, but it didn't exist. There were no planning assumptions built around war in Europe, in particular because there was a political imperative against what was called the limited liability. So the argument here is that Britain did not need ever again to commit its troops to the continent and have a continental commitment. Instead, it had a limited liability to its own interests. It might support France if it came to the crunch, but actually Britain was effectively saying that it could afford to cut itself off from the defense and security issues of the continent at a time when the First World War had demonstrated that that was not possible. That little moat between us and France wasn't going to stop war that was raging across Europe, engulfing us too. And that's where we came to in 1940. So, we came to a point where the British ostrich, very firmly had its head in the sand, not just about the nature of the threat facing us, but also about how you might be able to deal with it. Now, this is where the parallels with today are interesting, because actually the British Army knows very, very well the nature of the fight that it will have to undertake should the balloon go up in Europe again, and should it be deployed in support of NATO against an aggressor like Russia, for instance. And no one's arguing that Britain will ever do this alone, but actually you need to have the capability, so you need to have the ability to fight at a high intensity against a peer adversary, and to do that with allies. The moment you lose that, it's almost impossible to recover quickly. Well, it's not possible to recover quickly. It takes time and a lot of casualties. Fortunately, in the Second World War, both Hitler in Europe and Hirohito in the Far East gave us, Britain and the Allies, time to recover, retrain, rethink, rebuild, and refight. That's not always going to be the case. It's not always going to be possible for us to have that time to recover. And so here we have the fundamental problem. We've got an army in 1940 that doesn't know, because it's never sat down and integrated into its thinking and its structures the great lessons of 1918. As the generations moved on, there was no rebuilding of those ideas into the structures of the army. So in terms of our approach, we've said, well, an army needs to think about who it's likely to fight, then needs to explain or decide within itself how it's going to fight, and then it needs to create the full structures to be able to deliver the how in order to fight the why. And that virtuous circle was not created in the 1920s and 1930s, sadly.
But if the army aren't thinking about it, which is quite remarkable that they choose not to think about it, there are almost external contractors. You've got JFC Fuller and Little Hart who are thinking about how the next war is going to be fought. And are they... I always find Little Hart incredibly problematic, but how helpful was it was even them thinking about how armour might be used and movement, because they're the big evangelists that people like Dorman Smith are drawing on when he's thinking about things in the desert? Well,
so the real challenge here is because the army doesn't embrace the arguments that JFC Fuller and Little Hart are presenting. That dialogue, so that conversation, isn't an army-wide conversation. The army doesn't really like exposing doctrinal debate to public view. Those conversations took place in newspapers, and actually they took place on the periphery of what the army was doing. The big failure of the army was not to embrace the debate about how you deployed force, how you created a new capability, how you integrated capability, that's integrating armor, artillery, air power, and so on. And you left it to the apostles, the so-called apostles of mobility, so led by people like Fuller and Little Hart, who exaggerated their arguments. So both Little Hart and JFC Fuller, less so Little Hart at the start, but they exaggerated their arguments around the tank, and they presented the idea of the tank as being a form of mechanized and armored cavalry that could operate without infantry and achieve a strategic result, much like Fuller's Plan 1919, a plan that he was advocating and wasn't carried out because the war came to an end in 1919, where thousands of tanks would sweep behind German lines, discombobulate the rear, break up their logistics supply chains and so on, attack the command and control. Great ideas, all great ideas. But the idea was that we would have a battle on land like the battleships would fight a fleet action at sea, without the integration component that actually became incredibly important and had been incredibly important in 1918. So we leapt from something that worked very effectively in late 1918 to ideas that had never been proven. And the arguments actually were around the unproven ideas. Wouldn't it have been so much better to have developed our exercises and our planning and our ideas on the basis of what we already knew worked in 1918, developed doctrine and so on, that took that into account? No, none of that happened. And the arguments then became noisy debates that very, very quickly went into hyperbole and exaggeration. And so I think, both JFC Fuller and Little Hart had some brilliant ideas. Little Hart's views on the indirect approach and on the importance of operational art, that is, not just fighting battles for their own sake, but achieving strategic objectives. He's 100% correct. Unfortunately, they weren't directly knitted into the reality of fighting war. We can see this very, very directly in the influence of Little Hart during the Second World War. We had no influence whatsoever because the army and the country realized that they had to fight in a way that reflected 1918 and not the theorizing. So theorists have their place, but unless they're deeply embedded in the reality, the practical realities of war, they're a waste of time, they're a noisy distraction, and they're a problem in themselves. So we come to a balanced or a nuanced perspective on both men, which recognized their strength, recognized what they had managed to achieve, but actually they were also deeply problematic for the army.
Well, what struck me but when I read the book was the fact that they come up with ideas, but no one takes them and tests them. So what happens is you get these evangelists, and so it comes out in the desert where it's tank warfare, and they're believing in the tank and can't understand why they're getting walloped by a combined force of Germans.
Well, the problem with seeing tanks as ships on a battlefield on a land sea is that very, very quickly, if you've got tanks out there roaming in the desert, it's very easy to come up with ways to counter them. And Rommel did this very quickly by converting his 88 millimeter anti-aircraft guns in the ground role, and indeed he had ammunition to do that as well. But just as an aside, a high explosive anti-aircraft shell would take the turret off a British tank at 2,000 meters without a problem at all, just by virtue of kinetic energy. That's a real problem, and for some reason the British never really understood that actually the movement of forces against each other needed to be fully integrated. Tanks need to be protected by artillery and infantry and coordinated with air. As soon as you separate them out, you've lost them. The British, even in 1942, did not integrate their troops together. The armored division had a support group of infantry attached to it. The tanks were designed to operate, frankly, as armored horses whistling through the desert. And it's quite tragic to see how this happened, because in the 1920s and 1930s, Britain didn't sit down and exercise and train and develop doctrine in a way it should have done, because you can't do that in war fighting. In war, when you get to war, you've just got to fight, and if you've got the wrong approach to war fighting, you're stopped. We were lucky in a sense because by the time that the Second Battle of El Alamein began in October 1942 and ended in early November, the Great Reset took place, where Monty said, well, let's forget about maneuver. It's not working for us. I'm going to fight an attritional battle based on a teed-up battlefield built on my knowledge of 1917. I'm going to wallop the enemy. I'm going to destroy them piecemeal. And you didn't need the sophisticated armor, infantry, artillery, integrated tactics that we had demonstrated we couldn't operate, and the Germans could. So we could have fought El Alamein in a very different way but we didn't have the confidence to do so. And so the reset was, let's just go back to 1917 and fight a 1917 battle, not a 1918 one.
That's almost heretical, claiming that we're refighting First World War for 1970. Well, I was going to say, when the BAF landed in 1939, what were they expected to fight? A battle of 1914, 1916?
1914 and 1916. This is the great tragedy. We had forgotten 1918. Let me be even more controversial and say, when Montgomery reasserted the principle of firepower in October 1942, i.e. he was going to blat his way through the German defences with artillery primarily, and by the massive preponderance he had in the air, that principle, the application of force as being the fundamental determinant in military success, remained the central idea in the British Army until the mid-1980s, and we had a dramatic series of changes in direction undertaken at the behest of General Bagnall, and that's really quite extraordinary to think about. If we had remembered 1918 and we'd built the concepts of mobile integrated fighting at an operational level and to an adjacent concept of operational maneuver, i.e. we would maneuver to achieve a strategic objective. We wouldn't just fight a battle because we were soldiers and we like fighting battles. That's a really important thing. There's a testosterone of battle fighting here that's a real problem we need to get rid of. We would have fought the Second World War very differently and much more successfully from an earlier position, even though we didn't have the sort of equipment that we probably needed. So there's a matter of thinking about doctrine, thinking about fighting, that it was completely alien to the British Army, and alien really until the 1980s. It's shocking to think about it, but General Lord Dannatt and I, when we sat down and debated this, we both agreed this is quite extraordinary. And we were both, he was a little bit more senior than I, but I was a young lieutenant, platoon commander in an air mobile battalion in the early 1980s, seeing these new tactics be developed and pushed through by means of exercises, and it was fundamentally different to how we had constructed our warfighting, our approach to warfighting ever since 1942. It's frightening. So when the troops turned up in France in 1939, the Second BEF, they dug trenches. They thought they'd be fighting a war of 1914 again.
Because the other thing that struck me when you have the lack of doctrine, which you kind of touched upon, was the fact that the RAF have been splintered off, want to do their own things. They don't want to support the army. So it suits the RAF to be a strategic force rather than a tactical force, which is the opposite of what the Germans are trying to do.
That's exactly right.
You get that partisan kind of thing going on, which is probably right that they were sent off on their own. But then there's a kind of we need to stamp ourselves on the psyche of the military and be independent. So we're strategic, not tactical.
I know, and they very, very much resisted the demands of the army, and the demands of the army weren't as forcefully presented as they should have done to integrate operations with the army. The people thinking about defence saw fighting at two levels. One is a strategic level and the other is a tactical level, without recognizing that actually there is a level in the middle, which is the operational level, which is the level at which divisions, corps and armies are deployed. And in order to be successful, you need to integrate all the capabilities you have. So separating out the Royal Air Force was a disaster, frankly, for the operational level requirement. And to be honest, it wasn't something that was rebuilt until maybe October 1943 with the establishment of the 2nd Tactical Air Force in Europe, getting ready for D-Day. So a tactical air force, an air force dedicated to ground operations. And this is quite extraordinary. And it meant that we had a Royal Air Force that, yes, fought air battles in the sky against bombers and intruders coming in, but was fundamentally designed to drop bombs on the enemy. And would drop bombs on strategic targets, even though we know that much of that was largely a waste of time.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Rob Lyman, and we're talking victory to defeat. So is there truth that the interwar army, is the truth that David Lowe's interwar army from the Evening Standard cartoon is just full of Colonel Blimps?
No, that's another fascinating product of our book. We started researching, thinking that we were going to find lots of Colonel Blimps. Do you know what? The only Colonel Blimp we found was in David Lowe's cartoon. There was an enormous amount of discussion in the newspapers and the military journals, many more military journals than there are today, around the future of warfighting. But as I said earlier, it wasn't coordinated. It wasn't structured within an army-wide context, and it didn't have the discipline of the army owning those conversations. So they were misguided in a way, but they were misdirected. They weren't controlled. The army was blimpish only in the extent that it was comfortable with what it was doing in terms of its commitment to imperial defense. A wider problem was the fact that the Cardwell system forced the army to, in Britain, to support an imperial commitment. So what is the Cardwell? Well, from the 1870s, when the Cardwell system was established, each infantry regiment had 2 battalions. One battalion would be deployed abroad, mainly in India, for the defense of the empire, and the other battalion would be at home, and it would be used as the anchor for the regiment, for recruitment and for training and so on. It wasn't designed as a deployable component at all. There was no deployable expeditionary component. And when the Second Expeditionary Force went out, BEF went out in October, November, December 1939, it didn't go out as a deployable expeditionary force. It went out as the sum of a large number of the first battalions of the British Army that had never worked together, never trained to operate at a brigade or a division or a corps level, never done it. There had been a number of exercises in the early 1930s, but they had petered out. And the exercise that did take place happened to focus on arranging logistics and transporting units from one place to another, not on operational maneuver. So the army turned up really so completely unprepared for the Second World War, it's embarrassing to contemplate it. And the reason why the German offensive only took 6 weeks to unravel the British Expeditionary Force and indeed the French, it's very easy to see. There are a number of people out there today who believe that we exaggerate, that the Germans really succeeded in 1940 because by accident, that von Kleist wasn't a great supporter of the German penetration tactics that were espoused and advocated by men like Guderian. And to an extent, that's true. But what the German army had done, it built itself around a number of characteristics that were alien to us. It was fully integrated. Troops were used to operating with armor and artillery and aircraft, even though we had a much more mechanized army than the Germans, and the German logistical tail relied very dramatically on horses to the extent that ours didn't. But that made no difference at the end of the day when junior officers and NCOs were trained to take fleeting chances. They were inculcated with the idea of mission command. Junior soldiers knew the intent of their higher commanders and did everything they could to achieve them without waiting for orders. And remember that the German strategic objective for their campaign in 1940 was to get to the Channel Coast, because they knew that by doing that, they'd divide the British and the French armies in that area above the Maginot Line. When your operational objective is the Channel and you're attempting to get there by any means possible, then you give the opportunity for men like Guderian, frankly, to have their head and to do what they want. So those people who criticize, who suggest that actually the Germans did all this, it was achieved by accident, are frankly wrong. The German mentality and the German approach to warfighting was fundamentally different. It was a much more intelligent approach to offensive capability and the deployment of defensive capability than we had ever. Well, we hadn't contemplated it. Now, it's very interesting when you look at 1940 and you say, well, could this be countered? The truth is, yes, very, very easily, because the Russians did that in 1943. in the East, they were eventually able to work out ways of containing these armored pincers that were driving towards you. And the British Army in the 1980s, we called these counter-penetration positions. And you basically needed to have the same mobility and anti-tank capability, effectively, to stop the armor that's coming, stop the aircraft that are coming, stop the armor that's coming, and degrade it as it's moving towards you. That you use defense in depth. Now, okay, we entirely accept the entire mentality of the French strategic position in the 1920s and 30s was based on building a big wall between them and Germany, called the Maginot Line. And there was no defense in depth. And the idea of building defense in depth, maybe for 100 miles back from the Ardennes, the Meuse, all the way into southern Belgium, was politically unacceptable in France. But it would have been the thing that would have solved the problem of 1940. And I go back to the point that I made right at the start. The real challenge in 1940 is that we didn't understand the British, well, by we, I mean the British Army, didn't understand how the Germans would fight. And that was because the Germans had concentrated on learning the lessons of 1918, and we had not.
So when are you going to write the iconoclastic book about Montgomery, and he's not the general we thought he was because he was stuck in 1917?
Well, it's partly been done by my very good friend, Peter Caddick Adams. In Peter's book, Parallel, I've forgotten the name of it, it's Monty and Rommel, Parallel Commanders. It's a brilliant book. And he traces the military lives of both Rommel and Monty. He makes this point, he's not a great fan of Monty in terms of his warfighting abilities, but he recognizes that he was the man for the moment to reset the British and the Eighth Army, to stop Rommel, to clear the Germans, the Afrika Korps, and the Italians out of North Africa. But actually, he's not, he recognizes that Montgomery didn't deploy the innovative tactics that the Germans were using in 1940 and didn't develop those tactics to enable our resources to be used efficiently and in an integrated way. He did what was necessary with the tools that he had, and his intervention was as much political as it was militarily. It's always been my aim one day to write a book about this, but it is true to say that Monty fought the war from the perspective of his tidy battlefield, his well-planned, tidy battlefield, the 1917 battlefield. And, it's a very interesting point about Northwest Europe in 1944, how the British 21st Army fought. And there are some very, very good recent books on how the British Army fought. And, on the whole, it's too easy to dismiss the 21st Army Group and Monty's tactics as being inappropriate. But it is true also to say that Monty tried advances on wide fronts. He didn't try an updated version of the German 1940s approach because he didn't believe in it. He wasn't a convert to the idea of the integrated operational maneuver group that the Wehrmacht had deployed so dramatically successfully. And therefore, it was relatively easy to contain Montgomery in June, July, and early August 1944. But you can exaggerate those arguments. Montgomery had the bulk of the German army fighting against him, and he needed to be able to degrade them to allow people like Patton to break out of Cherbourg and race behind him to the Meuse, to Metz rather. So, it's very interesting. But look, I think I absolutely agree. Montgomery was not the master of the maneuver battlefield in the same way that Rommel was.
I posed this to Kevin Hamel, who's just written he's writing the Patton biography. I said, because Patton gets unstuck at Metz. And I said, I wonder what would happen if you put Monty at Metz and Patton at Arnhem. Would you have a changing thing where Patton just bludgeons his way through and Monty has one of his tidy little battles and sorts out Metz possibly quicker than Patton?
I like Carlo Dest's biography of Patton. Carlo Dest, clearly American, had been an infantry commander, and I think he got to brigadier or colonel or brigadier. So he understood tactics in a way that lots of other historians don't. But I think it's true to say that that Patton had his opportunity only because he wasn't confronted by the mass of the German army that was confronting Montgomery. And a lot of people who are very, very happy to attack Monty in Northwest Europe, in part because of Monty's exaggerated pronouncements about John, actually don't understand the battle, and that's it's not right to say that Patton was a maneuverous commander in a way that Monty wasn't. That's true. Monty wasn't a maneuverous commander, but Patton wasn't either. Patton didn't succeed by deploying maneuver. He succeeded by not being opposed by the.
It's always helpful, isn't it?
It's always very helpful. And the better way of seeing it is that actually Monty and Patton were working in conjunction together, unwittingly, where Monty's forces were acting as the anvil and Rommel's forces were acting as the hammer. And that's how Eisenhower saw it.
I'll have to ask Peter Caddick-Adams if he'll join me to talk about Montgomery. That would be interesting. Well, Robert, as we stray beyond 1940, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining me. Loyal listener, I can highly recommend Victory to Defeat the British Army 1939-40. It is superb. I thought it pulled together much of the academic work on the last 2 years of the First World War very well before going on to discuss the interwar years and the British Army in 1940. Don't forget, if you have enjoyed the podcast, you can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/WW2podcast, where if you use the Patreon custom RSS in your podcast software, you can enjoy advert-free listening. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.